Suu Kyi. Suu Kyi, this woman right here, is the state counselor to the state of Myanmar, or was the state counselor to the state of Myanmar. Why not president? Because she has a foreign-born husband and foreign-born children, which stopped her from taking that role, so the state counselor role was made for her. So, what is special about this woman and what led up to these events? So, for a very, very, very long period of time, Myanmar was a military junta. A military junta basically is a military dictatorship. The military controls society. The military said what you can and can't say. The military said who could cover the news and in what manner. The military produced propaganda. The military would flaunt its might. And the international community broadly condemned them. They had a terrible relationship with the Muslim minority within its borders. And many people around the globe condemned them, placed sanctions upon them, and despised them. The military junta, though, had a decent relationship with the state of China, traded with China, and was able to sustain itself. And what mattered to the military junta was power, and its hold on power within Burma, now Myanmar. Now, Suu Kyi has a father. That father helped gain the independence of Burma, now Myanmar, and was also a very prominent figure in the military before he was killed when Suu Kyi was 2 years old. She then ran around the world, studied. I believe she went to Oxford to study with the world's elite before returning home in a very convenient year. The year was 1988. She came back in 1988, and that was when the 88 protests began against the military junta and for freedom, democracy, and against the brutality. The military junta responded with shooting protesters, beating protesters, torturing protesters, the suppression of speech, what you expect from a brutal dictatorship which does not have the consent of the governed. She acted like a hero. Because of her ties to her father, who helped found the country, she was looked to for leadership. And so she led. She resisted. And she was thrown into prison time and time again, placed under house arrest, all the way up to 2010. From the year 1988 all the way up to 2010, she was placed in and out of house arrest and in and out of prison time and time and time again, merely for standing up for her right to free speech, for standing up for democracy. This got her a Nobel Peace Prize, one she duly deserved at the time. And now, with all these constant protests, the international attention, her continuing the struggle, no matter how much they tried to delay her cases, to deny her freedom, eventually, an agreement was made. And the agreement was a power-sharing agreement between the military and a civilian government. This power-sharing agreement basically said that there would be a civilian government in Myanmar, but the military would have immense power. Immense power. That civilian control of the military that we take for granted, not exactly going to exist in this new state. 25% of the representatives are automatically military. They get 25%. And conveniently, you need a 75% majority to do constitutional reform to change that system. So it is structurally built so that you cannot reform the system without somewhat the military's approval. Structurally, it is built in that manner. Now, they also get key cabinet positions. Pretty important cabinet positions. Now, I could go on, But basically, what I'm trying to get at here is that the military preserved a lot of its power. Why did they open up in the first place? To even allow the situation where they gave out some, they wanted to open up trade to the rest of the world, and they had sanctions placed upon them, the pressure of protest, but they seceded power, but not all of it. And so, Suu Kyi, the person who fought for democracy all of her adult life, and let me tell you just how much she fought for democracy. Her husband was actually a British man who she had children with. This would actually come to haunt her politically later, because since she had foreign-born children, she could not become president, so that's why the role of state counselor was made, so she could be the de facto leader of the country. But that's just a tidbit, like, little factoid that I know. When her husband was diagnosed with colon cancer, she wanted to leave and visit him. No, she wanted him to come to her in Myanmar. But the military junta would not allow it. They said she would have to leave to go to Great Britain to visit her dying husband. But if she did, that would have meant they probably would have locked her out of the country and stopped her from returning, and stopped her efforts to fight for democracy. She ultimately did not leave to visit her husband, and was not able to be with her spouse during his dying moments. That's how much she dedicated herself to that struggle for democracy. And that's why I think at that point, we'll get back to it later, she deserved that Nobel Peace Prize. Anyway, 2010, this power sharing agreement is put into place. And her party, the NLD, which stands for the National League of Democracy, for Democracy, sorry, wins in a landslide. And it actually catches the military government off guard. They wanted more of their allies to actually win. But her party wins in a landslide, and she became state counselor. Now, this is where the waters for her get choppy, and where I think she lost that right to be known as that peace advocate who got the Nobel Peace Prize. Basically, the military junta and the new government that was formed did not have a great relationship with Rohingya Muslims. And, long story short, they ethnically cleansed them and forced over 750,000 of them out of the country, and she was complicit during that. She went on the international stage and defended the military in its actions during its ethnic cleansing, during its genocide. She was complicit. The military did the killing, and she did the PR. So, I'll answer questions at the end, by the way. That's the thing. I just want to make sure that we all have a total picture of the person we're dealing with here who was removed. I don't want to give you a rosy picture of this person. Some people will try to. I will not. Anyway, there's another election in 2020. And she wins again in a landslide, something that caught the military off guard. Again, they thought they were more popular than they really were. The civilians, the people of Myanmar, remember the military junta. They remember the brutality. They remember the lack of freedoms. They remember that. Oh, one last thing. On the Rohingya question. There was also journalists that were arrested in the country for covering that she did not speak up for and try to defend. So there's another point against her. But again, the National League for Democracy was winning out. They kept winning, and I'm not talking like 52%. I'm talking landslide victories. And this pissed off the military. And so a claim that we as Americans have heard before comes out. And this is not something that was born out of American politics. This is something that has a history in Myanmar. I mostly remember back to 1968, something similar. They came out and the military alleged massive voter fraud. Massive voter fraud. And that's why she won. And there has to be an investigation. Because, wow, look at those votes. She won in such a landslide. Massive voter fraud. Now, that sounds familiar. And I'll talk about that maybe later. But I think we all understand why that, as Americans, kind of hits close to home recently. The use of voter fraud in a disingenuous manner to just throw out the fact that you can't take an L. And let me be clear, there has been no evidence presented from the military to show there's been voter fraud. There's no evidence. They've got nothing to back up their claims. There's been nothing presented to the international community. There's been nothing presented to courts. There's been nothing presented, period. There is no evidence of voter fraud. They threw it out there because they could not take an L. That's why. But, you know, they chanted, "Stop the steal. Stop the steal." And so, the military, citing emergency powers, which they don't even have under the Constitution, by the way. The president's supposed to have that. But they were saying that since the president was no longer the president due to the coup, it falls to the vice president, who just so happens to be a former general in the military, who then authorized it. That's their constitutional order. They just throw the Constitution aside. And the reason why they use these emergency powers, which they didn't even have, was because of the voter fraud that didn't exist, they had no evidence of, period. This is what the QAnon people wanted to happen in this country, but for real. And so, they detain State Counsellor Suu Kyi. They detain multiple leadership, lots of leadership, people in cabinet positions, etc. They detain activists who are not even part of the government, but they detain the activists because the military knows they're unpopular. They're doing this because they can't win an election because they're unpopular, and they don't want the activists to organize their community against this, because if they do, if the people unite against this coup, then that could mean trouble for their power. And of course, they detain journalists as well. They don't want people covering what they're about to do. The military deploys all across the country. They take Parliament. Parliament has been suspended. And the chief, the chief of staff, I believe, or the chief of the military, the leader of the military, basically is the de facto leader of the country now. Why the vice president, who is also just so happens to be a former military general, is now acting president. And they have a state of emergency for 1 year. What does that mean? Well, that means basically the election meant nothing. And the parliament's suspended. It means that freedom of speech, good luck with that. Freedom of movement, nice try. Basic freedoms, no siree. It means for the next year, where they might have an election then. And I say might, because this isn't the last, this wouldn't be the first time they've ever delayed an event coming by, delayed the inevitable. Suu Kyi was supposed to have court hearings on whether she is being rightfully detained during military junta age, during the age of the military junta, and they delayed her court cases 4 times in a row. 2022 could roll around and they could just say, actually, due to voter fraud things never being answered, we need to delay it another year. They could just keep going. I mean, now, they acted outside of the Constitution if we're being real here. So what stops them from doing that, really? Anyway, the military is de facto the leader of Myanmar now. A military dictatorship, a military junta has returned to Myanmar with a vague promise for election a year from now. And there's a state of emergency, giving them immense power over the country. The democratically elected leadership of Myanmar has been deposed because the military couldn't win an election in a system that was rigged in their favor in the first place because they get 25% automatically. They get exclusive veto power. They get cabinet positions. They get so much, and even in the system rigged against them, they lose. And they can't take it. So, the international reaction has been swift. Australia, America, many countries have condemned it. America in particular. I think Biden's going to react in some manner, and it seems from the statement that was released, they said that if Suu Kyi and other leadership are not released, that they will have a response to this, meaning they do have something in the works. Personally, I would suggest Majenski sanctions before thinking of going from there. That would be the first step in my mind. That's something that you could use to directly target the people involved. China's stance on this is extremely interesting. This is where you get in some geopolitical chess here. China has always had a good relationship with the military. Always had a great relationship with the military. When it was the military junta, they got along fine. When the international community condemned and sanctioned Myanmar, they continued to trade with them. Myanmar's part of the Belt and Road Initiative. There's the Myanmar-China Economic Corridor. They've got a history of cooperation. They've come out with a statement, which I find quite interesting. Because while the rest of the world is condemning them, they're doing something that we like to call enlightened centrism.
We noticed what's happening in Myanmar, and we're knowing more information. China is Myanmar's friendly neighbor. We hope all sides in Myanmar can properly manage their differences under the constitution and the legal framework to uphold political and social stability.
So, let me translate that. Let me translate that for you. What that's saying is, yo, good luck. We'll work with whoever. They've had a good relationship with the military before. Even the military junta. In fact, 3 weeks before this coup occurred, they not only met with Suu Kyi, they also met with military leadership. Let me show you how deep this goes. When the Rohingya genocide was occurring, and Suu Kyi was playing defense on the world stage, while the military was slaughtering Muslims, and over 750,000 Rohingya were expelled from the country in an ethnic cleansing campaign that is currently being heard in the International Court of Justice. When that was going on, China backed them up. They were giving them fist bumps, saying, looks like it's good to me. And you know what happened a few years later when Xinjiang got some pressure? Well, Myanmar was there to return the favor. These ties lie deep. I will say, though, which is an interesting factor to take into consideration, Suu Kyi also recognizes that there are people in Myanmar that are growing concerned with the amount of influence China has in the region and within the country. And there has been talk, and possibly a few move-aways, even though they still have deep economic ties, about maybe Myanmar should start looking outwards. I mean, part of the reason why they opened up for democracy is because they didn't want to be dependent on China. Something to consider. And of course, the civilian response to this has been depressing. They're very not happy. Of course, when they vote for a party overwhelmingly, and they see even 10 years after the military junta lost its control and they went over the civilian rule, so-called civilian rule, when you see how much military influence is still there, you see them stocking up on food, talking in very depressing attitudes, because they know at the end of the day, if they go on the street and protest, they have memories of the military junta and what that meant. Getting butchered, slaughtered, tortured, arrested, beaten. They remember that. That scares them. They were happy with the evolution of events further away from military control. Of course, it wasn't perfect. The fact that the military has veto power, 25% of the government off the bat, and exclusive cabinet positions, of course, it wasn't perfect. But it was much better than the military junta when it comes to the fact of the people getting a say in governance. But they have gone onto the street a little bit. Even with that threat of brutalization, some of them have still actually gone onto the street. Let's see if I can find it. Here it is, right here. Now, this is from RT. I don't like to use RT as a source, but this is the only footage I could find. Now, while that might not be a ton of people, the fact that any came out when they have the memory of the military junta in the back of their minds shows how angry they are and how dissatisfied they are with this coup. That they wanted to go closer to democracy, not away from it. And of course, as is with all protest, the milk. The milk. There's always spilled milk at protests these days. Always. So, there has been a state of affairs enacted where, of course, we've already talked about they can, freedom of movement means nothing. Now, freedom of speech means nothing. They've arrested activists and journalists on top of the cabinet members and government officials. There was also internet outages and certain messings about when it came to communication and telephone lines, etc. Because if there's communication amongst the people, then they can organize protests like this, which, of course, when they know they're unpopular, that's going to be used against them. They know, and the military's acted in a manner where they know that they're unpopular and that this was an election fraud. They know it. If they were popular, then they wouldn't have to arrest activists to stop people from organizing against them. They wouldn't have to have all these internet outages and cut telephone lines and go through this whole process. They wouldn't have to. Then they would just take over and everybody would be happy. They're doing it because they know, the military knows fundamentally, that they're unpopular. And so they're acting from the way they've been maneuvering since the coup has started as if they're unpopular, because they are. So, this is an extremely sad event. It's extremely depressing. The reaction I expect from the international community will be along the lines of sanctions from the West. I think Joe Biden, since this is the first major event during his presidency, will take some leadership here. This is also in the Pacific, a region he wants to be more active in. Majinsky sanctions is something I would suggest. They might go and reenact some of the sanctions that existed during the military junta's time. Australia and other nations have come out and condemned it. The United Nations spokesperson came out and condemned it, asking for these people to be released. China, of course, is doing the balancing act because they want there to be stability on their border. They have a good relationship with the military, and they want to preserve that relationship with Myanmar. And they don't really care or have any interest in whether democracy comes or goes, because, of course, the Chinese government has no favorable view towards democracy. It's an extremely sad situation, and I hope that everybody in Myanmar stays safe and they're doing okay. I really do. And they all I just hope God's on their side.